Hi, my name is Amaya Lamb, and I'm a senior at Science Leadership Academy, and for my capstone, I'm going to be creating a 2-part video essay series, and this video is on queer coding in the media. There have always been a plethora of queer-coded characters in media, some good, some bad, and some where it's too hard to tell and everyone has a different opinion on whether someone is good representation or not. As a queer person myself, I obviously have a lot of opinions on queer coding as a whole, its role in media, both in the past and today. First, what is queer coding? If you don't already know, queer coding is when a character or plot will be given characteristics similar to the queer experience, whether that be purposeful or not. These characteristics can be anything from experience, habits, style, or clothing, and all things like that. In the past, most people equate queer coding to villainy, notably seen in Disney movies, some of the most iconic ones being Hades, Ursula, Jafar, Ratcliffe, and so much more. There's 2 main categories that I've found that these queer-coded villains fall into: weaponizing femininity and the outcast. Take Hades, for example. He is the antagonist to the ultra-masculine protagonist, Hercules. When he is made to oppose such a masculine main character, Hades is given more stereotypically feminine traits. His body language, mannerisms, and way of speaking is more feminine, thus weaponizing and villainizing femininity in a male character. Being extremely feminine is also another stereotype of a gay man, which is implemented into this type of queer coding. This same queer coding can be seen in characters from Jafar and Ratcliffe. Ursula, on the other hand, her character design is made to resemble a drag queen. In the other category, we have the state of being outcasted. These villains and a lot of other queer-coded characters are driven by being outcasted from society, by being different and rejected by those around them for being something or doing something that has a stigma around it in their normal society. Is this ringing any bells? Being outcasted is also almost always interconnected with this demonization of femininity, and they will be outcasted for that reason. While I'm not saying that any character that has been outcasted or rejected by their society or community is inherently queer or queer-coded, but when this is put in combination with other traits and methods of queer coding, this driving motivation of a lot of villains resembles the queer experience. Back to male queer-coded characters often being feminized, it also brings us back to the role of demonizing femininity and the role misogyny often plays in queer coding. Sexism and misogyny have always been present in media and the film industry, and these systems not only affect the presence and representation of women in film, it impacts the relationships of men. Women are not given much depth, motives, or complex characteristics, and this doesn't help when women often act as love interests and are supposed to have a compelling relationship with their male counterparts. These heterosexual relationships are then in turn lackluster because of the lack of depth and intent on half of the relationship. Since men are the only complex characters, stories will then revolve around their dynamics with each other, and their relationships will be more complex, have more chemistry and purpose. Thus, the audience, us, becomes attached to these characters and their relationships. The combination of the heterosexual relationships being poorly developed and written, and the same-sex dynamics being so developed, they come off as gay and can accidentally become queer-coded. To no one's surprise, this is a common occurrence in media because of, you guessed it, misogyny. It's actually quite a funny phenomenon how heteronormativity plus misogyny can actually equal homoeroticism. Many times characters who end up being queer-coded were not intended to be at all, and people have different opinions on what this means for the community. In my opinion, I can separate queer-coded characters into 2 other types, purposeful and non-purposeful, with pros and cons for each of them. Let's start off with purposeful. With purposely queer-coded characters, the creators had the obvious intent of making them seem queer, which is good in terms of representation in media, but again, this is referring to coded characters, not explicit ones. Oftentimes, these characters are also coming from cisgender and heterosexual people, and when they try to make a character queer, it's built off of stereotypes and they may come off as fetishy. With non-purposefully queer-coded characters, the obvious is that they were not intended to come off as queer, and so it's saddening to see that there was no intent to create more representation, at least a small bit of it. When characters are not intended to come off as queer, it also means that people can deny or reject the otherwise obvious queer coding of the story and use the reasoning that the creator didn't mean it that way to be a little homophobic, or a lot homophobic. This can be seen in the recent Pixar film Luca, where a lot of people are denying the obvious queer allegory of the entire story. However, with non-purposeful, this also means it's less likely the media has harmful tropes or stereotypes. Since they do not have the purpose of being queer, the traits and experiences they imbue into the characters and story won't have the bias they might normally have. Now, in my own personal opinion, I think the non-purposeful characters are more interesting to analyze and look at, but also I think it's funny to watch people get really mad and not want to admit something is gay. Now I'm going to kind of circle back to an idea I talked about earlier when talking about villainy and queer coding, specifically the experience of being outcasted. One false idea that a lot of people may have about queer coding is that characters can only be queer coded if they express interest in the same gender. But queer coding is so much more than that. It can consist of metaphors, experiences, symbolism, etc. For example, the outcasting I discussed earlier is an example of an experience that characters can go through that symbolizes the queer experience. This can include family relationships, relationships with gender, and society. Dead Poet Society is a great example of a story that is queer-coded in both the narrative and the relationships between the characters. Neil's relationship with his parents and who he is resembles the queer journey, and also Neil and Todd's relationship with one another is queer-coded. Now, a great and well-known example of a story that is solely narrative-based is Elsa from Frozen. While Elsa doesn't show any interest in women in the film, and I'm going to exclude Honeymaren from Frozen 2, her experiences and treatment from others can be interpreted as a metaphor for being queer. From a young age, Elsa's parents encouraged her to repress and hide her powers, similarly to how someone would hide their sexuality. This repression of her powers causes self-hatred for them within her, and she becomes afraid of the knowledge of her having powers come out, like she's scared of, coming out. When her powers do get revealed, she is met with hatred and fear from those around her, and then runs away to a place where she can be unapologetically herself, at least at the time. At the end of the film, the ultimate resolution is love, and Elsa accepting it from both others and herself. I could go on more about the queer metaphors within the second film, Frozen 2, specifically with the song Show Yourself, but I think you get the general gist. This is by no means a hot take, as Elsa is one of the most popular examples of queer coding, but I wanted to go through her story to show how she is heavily queer coded through her experiences despite having no explicit same-sex attraction or alluded same-sex attraction. Another thing I want to address, especially in today's climate, is the necessity of queer coding. The original purpose of queer coding was to give characters queer traits that were not super obvious to the majority, since queerness and LGBTQ+ representation was so demonized and taboo. Not that it still isn't today, however. But by queer coding them, queer people would recognize these patterns without giving explicit representation. But in today's society, representation is much more common and acceptable, and there are many types of media that have representation. How good that representation is another question, though. There are shows such as Sex Education, Atypical, Schitt's Creek, Euphoria, and a lot more. There are also a lot of children's shows that have strong and important representation like She-Ra, The Owl House, Steven Universe, Adventure Time. With media having more and more representation, it's beginning to set the precedent and standard of what is shown in media. With this, a big question that has surfaced is, should queer coding be necessary in today's society? In my opinion, a question this complex doesn't have a simple answer, and everyone has a different opinion. A lot of people have the idea of why queer code when you can just include representation. At the same time, a lot of media is still conservative with its representation, and when it does have representation, it's normally bad or pretty insignificant. Another issue that comes with this question is a lot of companies will find out they've accidentally created queer-coded characters and will then use them to queer-bait audiences. Marvel. In my opinion, I find queer-coded characters often come off as better representation in a sort of sense of representation than explicit ones. However, this is obviously not always true, but it's just a pattern I've noticed within myself. Representation will only become more normalized as time passes, and so the answer to this question can't really have an answer at this point in time. The relationship between queer representation, queer coding, and the queer community is complex, but as media, shows, movies, etc. keep getting created and queer people are more represented both in and behind the screens, the answer to this question is ever evolving.